You're watching WECT News at 6.
A special report tonight as we wrap up Black History Month. A significant part of Wilmington's Black history rediscovered. Original copies of a Black-owned newspaper in 1898 called the Daily Record. This newspaper, this edition, some say, is what provoked the start of the 1898 massacre. While lives and livelihoods were destroyed, this part of history, as a team of researchers learned, was not. It's November 10th, 1898. The Daily Record, a Black-owned newspaper, burned at the start of the infamous 1898 massacre. An editorial in the Black newspaper responding to a speech supporting lynchings of Black men who slept with white women. The Black newspaper printed that many white women were not raped by Black men, but slept with them willingly.
And so the Daily Record is responding to that with the editorial and saying, you call it rape after the fact many times because it's so upsetting to you, but in fact we're all human and sometimes these attractions happen, and those were words worth killing over.
But there was more to what provoked the riots. Wilmington was a great city for Blacks who made up about 50% of the population. Prominent Black businesses, abundant, people of color running the city.
And that drove the white supremacists crazy. That this was a good town to be Black in, and the Blacks were starting to get elected to political offices, and that you might have a situation where a white person goes into the post office or the Register of Deeds or whatever it is, and there's a Black person on the other side of the counter saying things like, well, you'll have to sign for that.
John Sullivan, a writer for the New York Times Magazine, along with a fellow researcher, Joel Fensel, started a nonprofit group called Third Party Project. While studying the 1898 race riots, the group that includes selected 8th graders from middle schools in Wilmington discovered that there were original copies of the Daily Record.
7 copies have surfaced so far. 3 copies actually showed up at the Schoenberg Library, the African American History Library in New York City. 3 were at the Cape Fear Museum in their archives. And Jan Davidson, the historian there, got in contact with us when we were first putting the project together and said, actually, we have 3 copies of that newspaper.
Alexander Manley was the editor of the Daily Record and was run out of town during the white supremacy campaign of 1898. And so they came to us from his family in the 1980s.
Davidson, an historian at the museum, says the original copies are kept in the basement of the museum, a safe place for papers over 120 years old.
The best thing you can do for a newspaper is to keep it in the dark. Light is a terrible thing for paper artifacts.
Sullivan says the greatest lesson to the students studying and researching the Daily Record is to understand if it ever existed, there's always a chance there's a copy somewhere.
The Wilmington Daily Record was thought of that way, as a lost African American newspaper, and you often see that in writing about 1898, that there was this very important newspaper. Sadly, no copies survive.
That they did is exciting for the students.
I think that's incredible because they said at the first meeting it was 6 years to get just those 7 copies.
Discovering these newspapers is going to help spread awareness about what happened back then and hopefully prevent it from happening in the future.
This one is particularly poignant and powerful because it's from October 20th, 1898, and the election was November 8th and the violence was November 10th.
Now, the exact number of Black people killed in the coup d'etat was never reported in the white newspaper, and of course the Black newspaper was gone. It's estimated as many as 300 Black people were killed in that massacre. All right, now I have a personal note to pass along to you. As we celebrate Black History Month, we want to remind you that it is important that Black History Month be observed every day. We want to shine a light on important places, people, and events in the Cape Fear region. The Giblin Lodge was built in 1871 on Princess Street. It became Wilmington's first African-American Masonic lodge. In 1875, the lodge hosted the first African-American agricultural and industrial fair in the county. The building also served as Wilmington's first African-American library in 1926, and in 1983, the Historic Wilmington Foundation recognized the site as a landmark. All right, coming back to a personal note from the Daily Record. In doing so much of the research and in talking with John Sullivan, we have since learned over the past few days that there was an original owner of the Daily Record. His name was Armand Scott. My mother's maiden name was Scott. She was Catherine Scott. The original owner of the Daily Record was my great uncle.